Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I should at the very outset apologize. I am in the midst of a miserable cold. All of you, I guess, or most of you are teachers, and so you must have, on many occasions like me, had the experience of being up in front of a class or giving a lecture when you have a head cold and things don't feel right. You can't think quite as clearly, you can't express yourself quite as well as usual, and so I apologize from the outset that you will experience this, I assure you, as I proceed. Yesterday, I had this cold already, and I was teaching a class to law students, and I began by saying more or less what I just did, and then going on and telling them that, first of all, to the extent they saw me sniffing a lot in class, they should not draw the inference that I am trying to emulate Brett Kavanaugh. And second, I told them that, and I've used this little story often when I've taught and been sick, that when I was a kid growing up in New York, I had a friend when I was about 8 years old or so, named David Dubler. And among the group of 5 or 6 or 7 friends, he always seemed to me, and I suspect the others, as a lot slower than the rest of us. And nothing clinical about it, but it was just obvious that he didn't get things, jokes, and whatever else it was that others did. And I used to wonder what it was like to go through life as Dave Dubler, sorry. And it was his brother. Some years later, I was a law clerk to Justice William Brennan on the Supreme Court of the United States. And one day, I was meeting with him in his chambers, and I was sitting across the desk from him, and we were talking about an opinion that I was working on. And he had a terrible cold, and he was coughing and sneezing, and I was thinking he really should go home. You know, I feel terrible for him. It's just awful. And then it suddenly occurred to me that he was probably sitting there thinking, this is what it's like to go through life as Geoff Stone. So what goes around comes around. Okay, so speaking of talking to students, in thinking about what to do this evening, I decided one of the most challenging issues that those of us who believe in the principle of academic freedom and free speech on campus have to face is how to explain to students why it is that this is a value that they should take seriously and should embrace. And I've had the opportunity on quite a number of occasions to give talks to students at colleges and universities around the nation about this subject. Places like Columbia and Williams and Dartmouth and Penn and University of Chicago and Wisconsin and LSU and Arizona State, Oregon, and so on. And it occurred to me that it might be useful to basically give you an example of what I think is how I at least try to explain to students why they should take these values seriously and should understand why they are central to the education that they are about to embark upon. So what I'd like you to do for a moment is close your eyes, really, close your eyes, and imagine that you are 18 years old and you are entering college for the first time, and this is one of the first talks you hear during orientation. And that's the basic thrust of what I will be presenting this evening. So now you can open your eyes as a child, or as a young adult, I should say, not to want to engage in a microaggression. And okay, so this is my talk. So whenever I speak to students, I can't help but recall an incident involving Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. At the time of this incident, Holmes was a very old man, nearing 90 years of age, in the autumn of his very long and very distinguished career as a justice on the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, on this particular occasion, Holmes was on a train headed north from Washington. He was deeply engrossed in reading a legal brief when the conductor knocked on the door to his compartment. Recognizing Holmes, the conductor respectfully asked for his ticket. Holmes looked in his coat pocket. No ticket. He looked in his vest pocket. No ticket. He reached into his trouser pocket. No ticket. Growing ever more frantic, Holmes began rummaging desperately through his briefcase, but still no ticket. At this point, the conductor, trying to calm Holmes, said, "Never mind, Mr. Justice, it's really not a problem. When you find the ticket, you can just mail it into the company." To which Holmes exploded, "You dolt, I don't give a damn about your ticket. I just want to know where the hell I'm supposed to be going." So as a student, you must often feel a bit like Justice Holmes. You want to know where the hell you're supposed to be going. And my task today is to offer at least some sense of direction. Now, I should like to begin by telling you a bit about my world. It is the world of the law. More specifically, it is the world of constitutional law. Now, law is about stories. It is about real people involved in real disputes with real consequences. So I shall tell you a story. Now, this story begins during World War I, and as you may or may not know, World War I was not a particularly popular war with the American people, whose sympathies were divided. Many Americans vigorously opposed the Wilson administration's decision to intervene in the brutal conflict that was then waging in Europe, arguing that our intervention was both unwise and indeed immoral. Not surprisingly, such opposition did not sit well with the government. In 1917, Attorney General Thomas Gregory, attacking the loyalty of war opponents, declared, quote, "May God have mercy on them, for they can expect none from an avenging government." Gregory wasn't kidding about the avenging government. In 1918, Congress enacted the Sedition Act, which made it a crime, among other things, for any person to utter any disloyal, scurrilous, or abusive language intended to cause contempt for the government of the United States, the Constitution, the military, or the flag. True to the Attorney General's threat, federal authorities launched more than 2,000 prosecutions against individuals who spoke or wrote against the war or the draft. One such prosecution involved 5 young Russian Jewish immigrants who were roughly your age at the time. In the summer of 1918, the United States sent a contingent of Marines to Vladivostok in Russia. Fearing that this was the first step of an American effort to crush the Russian Revolution, these 5 self-proclaimed socialists threw several thousand copies of each of 2 leaflets, one in English, the other in Yiddish, from several rooftops on the Lower East Side of New York City. The leaflets, which were boldly signed "The Rebels," were addressed to other Russian immigrants. After stating that the rebels hated German militarism, they warned those who worked in ammunition factories that they were producing bullets, bayonets, and cannon to murder not only the Germans, but also, quote, "your dearest, your best," who were in Russia and who were fighting for their freedom. The rebels were immediately arrested by the military police. After a controversial trial, they were convicted of violating the Sedition Act of 1918. The trial judge, disgusted by their behavior and by their beliefs, sentenced the rebels to terms ranging up to 20 years in prison. The rebels appealed their convictions to the Supreme Court of the United States, claiming that their convictions violated the First Amendment, which guarantees that, quote, "Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech." In Abrams versus United States, the Supreme Court, in a 7-2 decision, rejected this claim and upheld the convictions. For the majority of the court, this was an easy case. Because the natural tendency of the defendant's speech was to generate opposition to the war, it was not within the freedom of speech protected by the Constitution. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, the same Justice Holmes who some years later was to lose his railway ticket, dissented. Holmes' dissenting opinion in Abrams is worth reading, for it remains one of the most eloquent statements ever written by a justice of the Supreme Court about the freedom of expression. Holmes wrote, quote, "Persecution for the expression of opinion seems to me perfectly logical. If you have no doubt of your premises and want a certain result with all your heart, you naturally want to sweep away all opposition. But," he added, "when men have realized that time has upset many fighting faiths, they may come to believe that the ultimate good desired is better reached by free trade in ideas, that the best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market, and that truth is the only ground upon which our wishes can safely be carried out." Holmes therefore concluded that we should be eternally vigilant against attempts to check the expression, even of opinions that we loathe and believe to be fraught with death, unless they so imminently threaten compelling government interests that an immediate check is necessary to save the nation. Now, I first read this passage, which was written almost exactly 100 years ago, when I was a law student at the University of Chicago almost half a century ago. It has engaged my energy and my curiosity ever since. Indeed, I think it's fair to say that it was my puzzling over this passage that, for better or worse, put me on the path to my career, and indeed to where I stand before you today. But now I must change direction, for this is not to be a discourse on the First Amendment as such. It is rather to be a talk about academic freedom. Happily, these are not unrelated subjects. To the contrary, the longer that I puzzled over the meaning of free expression, and the longer I thought about education, the more the two seemed to me to converge. Indeed, neither is really worth all that much without the other. And with that in mind, I'd like to turn to what I see as the intersection of free expression and education, and to the subject of academic freedom. For it's at this intersection that we will find the most fundamental values of the world of higher education. Now, I hope to accomplish two things in this part of my talk. First, I will trace briefly for you the history of academic freedom, for it's only by understanding where we have been that we can appreciate, in both senses of that word, where we are today. And second, I will offer some thoughts about what all of this means for you and about the responsibilities that we today bear in common. It's important to understand that, like the freedom of speech, academic freedom is not a law of nature. It does not exist of its own force. It is always vulnerable and should never be taken for granted. Indeed, until well into the 19th century, real freedom of thought was neither practiced nor professed in American colleges. To the contrary, any real freedom of inquiry or expression in American colleges in this era was smothered by the dominance of religion and by the prevailing theory of doctrinal moralism, which assumed that the worth of an idea must be judged by what the institution's leaders declared its moral value to be. Thus, through the first half of the 19th century, American colleges squelched any notion of free and open discussion or of intellectual curiosity. Any student or faculty member, for example, who dared argue that women were equal to men, that blacks were equal to whites, or that homosexuality was not immoral, would surely be expelled or fired without hesitation. Similarly, through the first half of the 19th century, as the nation moved towards civil war, any professor or student in the North who openly defended slavery, or any professor or student in the South who openly challenged slavery, could readily be dismissed, disciplined, or expelled. When a professor at the University of North Carolina expressed sympathy for the 1856 Republican presidential candidate, the students burned him in effigy, and he was immediately dismissed by the Board of Trustees. When a professor at Franklin College in Pennsylvania admitted that he was not an abolitionist, he was promptly fired. Several decades later, a furious battle arose over Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, with traditionalists charging not only that Darwin was wrong, but also that his beliefs were dangerous, immoral, and ungodly. As a consequence of this conflict in the academy over evolution versus creationism, new academic goals came to be embraced. For the first time, to criticize as well as to preserve traditional moral values and understandings became an accepted function of higher education. And by 1892, William Rainey Harper, the first president of the University of Chicago, could boldly assert, quote, "When, for any reason, the administration of a university attempts to dislodge a professor or punish a student because of his political or religious statements, at that moment the institution has ceased to be a university." But despite such noble sentiments, the battle for academic freedom has been a continuing and fiercely contentious one. In the closing years of the 19th century, for example, businessmen who had accumulated vast industrial wealth began to support colleges and universities on an unprecedented scale. But that support was not without strings. And during this era, professors who offended wealthy donors by criticizing their business practices were routinely dismissed from such leading institutions as Cornell and Stanford. Then, during World War I, patriotic zealots persecuted and as we've seen, even prosecuted those who questioned the wisdom or morality of the war. In the face of such outrage, universities collapsed almost completely in their defense of academic freedom. Students and professors were systematically expelled and fired at colleges and universities across the nation, merely for encouraging a spirit of indifference towards the war. Similar issues arose again with a vengeance during the Cold War in the age of Joseph McCarthy. In the late 1940s and the 1950s, most colleges and universities excluded those even suspected of communist sympathies from university life. Yale President Charles Seymour, for example, went so far as to boast that, quote, "There will be no witch hunts at Yale because there will be no witches. We will neither admit nor hire anyone with communist sympathies." As this history demonstrates, the freedom to question, the freedom to challenge, the freedom to inquire are not to be taken for granted. Academic freedom is, in fact, a hard-bought acquisition in an endless and ongoing struggle to preserve the right of each individual, student and faculty alike, to seek wisdom, knowledge, and truth, free of the censor's sword. But what does all of this have to do with you? Well, in a radio address to America in 1931, the Irish playwright George Bernard Shaw startled his audience with the following proposition. Every person who owes his life to civilized society and who has enjoyed its very costly protections and advantages, he declared, should appear at reasonable intervals before a properly qualified jury to justify his existence, which should be summarily but painlessly terminated if he fails to do so. Now, I do not advocate such a program, but I do suggest that every one of us who enjoys the protections and advantages of our hard-won system of academic freedom has a responsibility to justify her existence under it. There are several ways in which we can meet this responsibility. First, we must defend academic freedom when it comes under attack. Like every liberty that is precious to us, the preservation of academic freedom demands vigilance, determination, and sometimes courage. Second, we must struggle to define the meaning of academic freedom in our time. As we saw in Abrams, the Constitution's guarantee of freedom of speech is not self-defining. Neither is academic freedom. Each generation must give life to the concept in the face of the distinctive conflicts that arise over time. Today, the principal challenge to academic freedom comes not from outside the academy, but from within it, from students themselves, some of whom demand censorship of ideas that they find to be distasteful and offensive, and from faculty members and university administrators who, afraid to disappoint their students, too often surrender academic freedom to charges of offense. To give just a few examples, several colleges and universities, including Johns Hopkins, Brown, and Williams, have withdrawn speaker invitations because of student objections to the views of the invited speakers. Colorado College suspended a student for making a joke that mocked feminism. The State University of New York denied promotion to a professor who criticized the university's affirmative action program. William & Mary and the University of Colorado disciplined students for criticizing their affirmative action programs. Students at Vanderbilt University demanded that a tenured professor be fired for writing an op-ed in which she raised questions about Islam and violence. The University of Kansas disciplined a professor for mocking the National Rifle Association. Louisiana State fired a professor because some of her women students complained that they had been made to feel uncomfortable by her use of profanity in class. At Wesleyan University, after the school newspaper published a student op-ed criticizing the Black Lives Matter movement, students demanded that the university defund the school paper. At Amherst College, students demanded that the administration remove posters stating that all lives matter. At Emory University, students demanded that other students who had shocked Trump in 2016 on the university's sidewalks should be punished because, in their words, the university is supposed to be a safe place for students, and this made us feel unsafe. And at a number of institutions, including DePaul, Claremont McKenna, the University of California, Irvine, San Francisco State, University of Pennsylvania, Michigan State, and Middlebury, students physically obstructed access to venues or shouted down speakers whose views they opposed, causing the events to be canceled. And to put all this in perspective, a recent survey revealed that 72% of current college students support disciplinary action against any student or faculty member who expresses views deemed by them to be racist, sexist, homophobic, or otherwise offensive. And as Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt report in their extraordinary new book, The Coddling of the American Mind, 58% of current college students stated that it is important to them to be part of a university community where, quote, I am not exposed to offensive ideas. So where did all this come from? It was not too long ago that students were demanding the right to free speech. Now, at least some students demand the right to be free from speech that they find to be offensive, upsetting, or emotionally disturbing. What explains this profound shift in attitude? One often expressed theory is that at least some members of this generation of students have been raised by so-called helicopter parents who've protected and celebrated them in every way, shielding them at every turn from the risks of failure, frustration, and defeat. On this theory, these students, unlike their predecessors, have never learned to deal effectively with challenge, uncertainty, insults, or fear. They therefore demand the right to be protected from speech that they find to be offensive, hurtful, or demeaning. If this is so, the proper role of an institution of higher learning is not to shield those students from distressing and offensive ideas, but to prepare them for the challenges of the real world. The goal of a university should not be to insulate students from discomfort and insecurity, but to enable them to be strong and effective citizens of the world, a world that will not shield them from such expression. Another possible explanation of the current situation is that this generation of students is more attuned than their predecessors to the injustices of society, to the harmful impact of hateful expression, and to the inequalities that poison our nation. To the extent that this is so, it might be in part a response to the creation of social media. When I was your age, remember you're 18, when I was your age, we were rarely exposed to hateful expression. The mainstream media never carried it, and although we knew it existed, we rarely directly confronted it. The world of social media has changed that. Today, it is difficult not to encounter hateful expression. And on this view of the matter, students today are not timid, but bold. They seek not shelter, but justice. They understand the ugliness of such expression, and they want to protect both themselves and, even more importantly, their classmates from the vitriol that now poisons some forms of expression. Still, another possible explanation for the current phenomenon is that some students, particularly those who come from disadvantaged, marginalized, and discriminated against backgrounds, have always felt unwelcome on college campuses. But in the past, they simply remained silent. On this view of the matter, this generation of college students, particularly those who themselves feel unwelcome and alienated, deserves credit, because instead of remaining silent in the face of oppression, they have the courage to demand equality and respect. And my own view, for what it's worth, is that there is an element of truth in all of these perspectives. But the question is what to do about it. Now, faced with the ongoing challenges to academic freedom at American universities, in 2014, University of Chicago President Robert Zimmer charged a faculty committee with the task of drafting a formal statement for the University of Chicago on the freedom of expression. Sorry. The goal of that committee, which I chaired, was to stake out our university's position on these issues. The committee consisted of 7 distinguished faculty members from across the university, and after broad consultation, in particular, I should say, with FIRE, which was enormously helpful to us, we produced a brief 3-page report. And at the risk of being self-indulgent, I want to read you some excerpts from that report. I know all of you may be familiar with it, but as an 18-year-old new college student, you're not. Quote, because the University of Chicago is committed to free and open inquiry in all matters, it guarantees all members of our community the broadest possible latitude to speak, write, listen, challenge, and learn. Except insofar as limitations on that freedom are necessary to the functioning of the University of Chicago fully respects and supports the freedom of all members of our community to discuss any problem that presents itself. Of course, the ideas of different members of the university community will often and quite naturally conflict, but it is not the proper role of the university to attempt to shield individuals from ideas and opinions that they find unwelcome, disagreeable, or even deeply offensive. Although the university greatly values civility, and although all members of the university community share in the responsibility for maintaining a climate of mutual respect, concerns about civility and mutual respect can never be used as a justification for closing off the discussion of ideas, however offensive or disagreeable those ideas may be to some members of our community. The freedom to debate and to discuss the merits of competing ideas does not, of course, mean that individuals may say whatever they wish, wherever they wish. The university may restrict expression that violates the law, that falsely defames a specific individual, that constitutes a genuine threat or harassment, that unjustifiably invades substantial privacy or confidentiality interests, or that is otherwise directly incompatible with the core functioning of our university. But these are narrow exceptions to the general principle of freedom of expression, and it is vitally important that these exceptions never be used in a manner that is inconsistent with the university's commitment to a completely free and open discussion of ideas. In a word, the university's fundamental commitment is to the principle that debate or deliberation may not be suppressed because the ideas put forth are thought by some or even by most members of the university community to be offensive, unwise, immoral, or wrong-headed. It is for the individual members of the university community, not for the university as an institution, to make those judgments for themselves and to act on those judgments not by seeking to suppress speech, but by openly and vigorously contesting the ideas that they oppose. Indeed, fostering the ability of members of the university community to engage in such debate and deliberation in an effective and responsible manner is an essential part of the university's educational mission. As a corollary to the university's commitment to protect and promote free expression, members of the university community must also act in conformity with the principle of free expression. Although members of our community are free to criticize and contest the views expressed on campus, and to criticize and contest speakers who are invited to express their views on campus, they may not obstruct or otherwise interfere with the freedom of others to express views that they reject or even loathe. To this end, the university has a solemn responsibility not only to promote a lively and fearless freedom of debate and deliberation, but also to protect that freedom when others attempt to restrict it. Now, interestingly, when we wrote this report, we were thinking only about the University of Chicago. And indeed, the first half of the report talks specifically about the history of the University of Chicago. It never occurred to us that it would be relevant to anybody else. But in no small part, because of fire, as you heard a few moments ago, the university statement has now been adopted by almost 50 colleges and universities across the country, including such institutions as Princeton, Columbia, Georgetown, the University of Minnesota, Amherst, University of Missouri, Purdue, Johns Hopkins, American University, Vanderbilt, and the University of Wisconsin, to name just a few. Okay, so now that I've finished congratulating myself, let me elaborate just a bit. Why should a university take the position that faculty and students should be free to advance any and all ideas, however offensive, obnoxious, or wrong-headed they might be? First, one thing we have learned from bitter experience is that even the ideas we hold to be most certain might in fact turn out to be wrong. As confident as we might be in our own wisdom, experience teaches that certainty is different from truth. If those who believed with absolute certainty that the earth was the center of the universe were wrong, if those who believed with absolute certainty in creationism were wrong, if those who believed that slavery was natural, right, and proper were wrong, if those who believed that a woman's place is in the home were wrong, if those who believed that homosexuals were degraded perverts were wrong, then why should we have the arrogance to think that we are unquestionably right about our own beliefs today? The only wise approach, as Justice Holmes made clear, is to acknowledge the risk that our certainties might be wrong as well, and that they too must always be open to challenge and to question. Second, experience teaches that the suppression of speech breeds the suppression of speech. If today I am permitted to silence those whose views I find distasteful, then I have opened the door to allow others down the road to silence me. The neutral principle of no suppression of ideas protects us all. And this is especially important in the current situation, for in the long run, it is likely to be minorities, whether religious minorities, racial minorities, or political minorities, who are most likely to be silenced once censorship is deemed acceptable. Indeed, without a vibrant commitment to freedom of speech, our nation would never have seen a civil rights movement, a women's rights movement, or a gay rights movement, all of which would have been suppressed by intolerant majorities if they were given the power to do so. Censorship is never a one-way street, and this is a door we do not want to open, perhaps especially in the era of Trump. Third, a central principle of free expression is the concern with chilling effect. The problem is especially acute today because of the effects of social media. It used to be the case that students and faculty members were willing to take controversial positions quite openly, in part because the risk to them of doing so were relatively modest. One could say something provocative or outrageous, and the statement soon disappeared from view and could be discussed. But in a world of social media, where every comment you make can be circulated to the world and can be called up later by prospective employers or graduate schools or neighbors or dates, with the mere click of a button, the potential cost of speaking courageously, of taking controversial positions, of taking risks, is in fact greater than ever before in history. Indeed, according to a recent survey, 65% of all college students now say that it is unsafe for them to express unpopular views. And this clearly has had an effect on faculty as well. In this setting, it is especially important for institutions of higher learning to stand up for free expression. So how should this work in practice? Should students, faculty, and other speakers be allowed to express whatever views they want, however offensive they might be to others? Yes, absolutely. Should those who disagree and are offended by those views be allowed to condemn the views and the speakers in the most vehement terms? Yes, absolutely. Should students, faculty, and community members who oppose a speaker be permitted to disrupt an event in order to prevent that individual from speaking? Absolutely not. Although non-disruptive protest is both permitted and encouraged, disruption of the rights of others to speak and to listen is wholly incompatible with the central principle of academic freedom. Should those who are offended and who disagree with the views of others be allowed to demand that the institution punish those who have offended them? Yes, absolutely. Should a university punish those whose speech annoys, offends, or insults others? Absolutely not. So what, though, should a university do? Well, first, a university should educate its students and faculty about the importance of civility and mutual respect. As a former student wrote to me recently, a university has an obligation to commit to create a community of people as well as a community of ideas, a place where everyone feels certain that they are unambiguously welcome. This must be a core institutional value, but it is a value that must be reinforced and reaffirmed by education and by example, not by censorship. Second, a university should encourage free, open, and robust disagreement, argument, and debate. It should educate its students about the history, the importance, and the fragility of free speech. And it should instill in its students and faculty the importance of winning the day by facts, by ideas, and by persuasion, rather than by forced disruption and censorship. Indeed, for an institution of higher education to fulfill its most fundamental mission, it must be a safe space for even the most loathsome, offensive, and disloyal arguments. As a former colleague of mine at the University of Chicago Law School, who stepped down as president a little under 2 years ago, observed in a recent commencement address, quote, "No matter how much you might disagree with certain speakers, don't try to shut them down. Let them talk, but have the confidence to challenge them. If the other side has a point, learn from them. If they're wrong, rebut them. Beat them on the battlefield of ideas. And you might as well start practicing now, because one thing I can guarantee you, you will have to deal with ignorance, hatred, racism, and stupidity at every stage of your life." Third, a university must recognize that our society being flawed as it is, the cost of free speech will often fall most heavily on those groups and individuals who feel the most marginalized, unwelcome, and disrespected. All of us feel that way sometimes, but in our often unjust society, the individuals who most often bear the brunt of free speech, or at least of certain types of free speech, tend to be racial and ethnic minorities, religious minorities, women, gays, lesbians, and transsexuals, immigrants, ideological dissidents, and the like. Colleges and universities must be sensitive to this reality. Even if they cannot solve this problem by censorship, they can and should take other steps to address the special challenges faced by students and by groups who are often made to feel unwelcome and unvalued by others. Institutions of higher learning must take this challenge seriously. They should encourage civility and mutual respect. They should support students who feel vulnerable, marginalized, and silenced. They should help those students learn how to speak up, how to respond effectively, how to challenge those whose attitudes, whose words, and whose beliefs offend, appall, and outrage them. This is a core responsibility of our institutions, for the world is not a safe space, and it is our job to enable our graduates to win the battles that they will face in the years and the decades to come. Now, speaking of the responsibilities of our universities, I should address one other critical facet of these issues. Suppose those who oppose the speaker, whether they be students, faculty, or community members, disregard their responsibility to respect the freedom of speech and threaten violence or otherwise attempt to disrupt an event in order to prevent an uninvited speaker from speaking. What should the institution do? After the events of Charlottesville last year, this is an especially important question. The simple solution, the obvious solution for the institution is to play it safe and just refuse to permit the speaker to come to campus. Indeed, this is the approach that several institutions have adopted. But if universities adopt this approach and thus empower those who oppose the speaker to prevent the event from taking place by threatening violence or disruption, what will happen? Such a response will inevitably encourage others who want to exclude speakers to adopt the same strategy, knowing that they too can shut down speech they oppose merely by threatening violence or disruption. This invites what the Supreme Court has called the Hecklers Veto. Such a course invites other groups to wield the power of censorship over whatever views they wish to suppress, whether those views be anti-war, pro-Black Lives Matter, anti-immigration, pro-Israel, anti-Trump, pro-abortion, anti-affirmative action, pro-gay rights, or whatever. In effect, the Hecklers Veto turns the right of free speech over to those who oppose the ideas that are being espoused. It's noteworthy, by the way, that the Supreme Court first learned the lesson of the Hecklers Veto in the Civil Rights era, when white Southerners threatened violence in order to shut down civil rights marches. What the court concluded is that the responsibility of the city, the police, or the university in such circumstances is to take all reasonable measures to protect the speaker and to enable the event to take place, and said that it can terminate the event only if it is effectively impossible for it to prevent a clear and present danger of serious harm. Short of that, though, the Hecklers Veto cannot be allowed to prevail. And I should make one other important point about the strategy of disruption. It is counterproductive. What it does is to give the speaker and her ideas greater visibility, turns her into a martyr, and enables her to sell books, get on cable news, and promote her views more effectively. People like Richard Spencer, Ann Coulter, and Milo Yiannopoulos, for example, were complete unknowns until they were made famous by violent protests against their views. Now they are household names and ever more sought-after speakers. As the Southern Poverty Law Center recently explained in a policy statement on the alt-right on campus, quote, "When an alt-right personality is scheduled to speak on campus, the most effective course of action is to deny the speaker the one thing that he or she wants most, a spectacle. Alt-right personalities know that their cause is helped by news footage of large jeering crowds, heated confrontations, and outright violence at their events. It allows them to play the victim and gives them a larger platform. Denying an alt-right speaker of such a spectacle is the worst insult they can endure. What the Southern Poverty Law Center widely recommends is that the best strategy for those students who oppose the speaker's views is to hold an alternative event away from the alt-right event to highlight the campus's commitment to the inclusion and to the nation's democratic values. And this response is clearly the right one across the boards, whether the speaker is a member of the alt-right, an opponent of gay rights, a supporter of abortion rights, or any other speaker whose views you oppose. But let me now return to my original central theme. What is it that makes for a great educational institution? It is, I submit, the intense, strenuous, and constant intellectual activity of the place. Presented with many points of view, students must be compelled to learn how to think for themselves. At a great educational institution, the air is electric with ideas and questions, and it is from that environment that students derive an intellectual stimulation that should last them the rest of your lives. This is the true meaning of education. Your responsibility as a student is to test what you are taught at every turn, to challenge your teachers, your classmates, and yourselves, to choose your own values and your own beliefs. To meet this responsibility, you will have to be independent, you will have to be daring, you will have to take risks. It is not easy to tell your professor, for example, who has devoted years, perhaps decades, to mastering her subject, that you disagree with her latest observation or theory. But the discourse of a great institution of learning should be an incitement to risk and to boldness. If you find yourself hesitating, if you feel timid, if you wonder if it's worth it, think of the rebels in Abrams. At an age not much older than you, they dared to take on the government of the United States. You certainly can take on a mere professor or a speaker. Fulfilling the responsibility of academic freedom means more than challenging your classmates and your teachers. It also means always challenging yourself. It means being willing to reconsider what you yourself have come to accept as true. In 1921, after 2 years in prison, Molly Steimer, one of the Abrams rebels, was deported to the Soviet Union. It was not what she expected. Disappointed in the political and economic system that she discovered there, Steimer again agitated against the government. Again, she was arrested, prosecuted, and convicted of sedition. In 1923, she was deported from the Soviet Union. I don't know for sure, but I rather suspect this was an unparalleled achievement. To be convicted of sedition and deported within 5 years from both the United States and the Soviet Union. Whatever you might think of her, Molly Steimer was not afraid to reconsider her positions. In 1919, a majority of the Supreme Court of the United States in the Abrams case rejected the bold approach of Justice Holmes and opted for a safe view of the First Amendment. 50 years later, the Supreme Court unanimously overruled the majority opinion in Abrams, and embracing Justice Holmes' dissenting opinion in that case, held that the government may not punish even speech that we loathe and believe to be fraught with death, unless that speech is both intended and likely to incite imminent lawless action. To reach that result, the court had to challenge the first principles of its predecessors and to overturn half a century of precedent. A great university, like a successful court, must dedicate itself to the rigorous, open-minded, unyielding search for truth. You will learn here to ask the hard questions, but it is not enough to examine the premises, beliefs, and assumptions of an earlier time and find them wanting. It is too easy to dismiss those who thought that the earth was the center of the universe, that its resources were boundless, that only men should vote, that marriage is only for people of the opposite sex, or that separate could ever be equal. You must remember that you too hold beliefs that your children or your children's children will rightly regard as naive, foolish, perhaps even obscene. You must be prepared to challenge your beliefs, to reform your world, just as the rebels in Abrams struggled to reform theirs. You too must challenge the nature of things. So to return to the question with which I began, where the hell are you supposed to be going? As you've no doubt surmised, your adventure has no predetermined path, no assigned destination. Let the journey engage you. For as the humorist Will Rogers observed almost a century ago, even if you are on the right track, you will get run over if you just sit there. At an institution like this, the faculty warmly welcome their students because students are where the future lies. From this place, you will take away an intellectual stimulation and curiosity that will last the rest of your lives. As Justice Holmes mused in Abrams, all life is an experiment. May your life's experiment be filled with curiosity, boldness, and courage. Thank you. So I'm happy to take questions, either as an 18-year-old or as you are in the present.
And I've got the microphone here, so I will be passing around, and we'll start here.
Hi, thank you. My question has to do with your conclusion, which I liked very much, and somewhere near the middle. The conclusion recommends a bold pursuit of truth no matter the consequences. Somewhere near the middle, you recommended seeking alternative venues when the bad speaker comes to town. And so I'm wondering what you make of what I read Mill, I think in chapter 3, to say that not only can't I silence the speaker, but I can't stigmatize the speaker either, which seems to be a more open position than the one you seem to be suggesting.
I believe in civility, and therefore I don't think one should stigmatize a speaker in a way that is truly uncivil, but I think that one should express the passions of one's views, and that it's appropriate to express not only what you think, but how strongly you believe it. And so I guess it depends what one means by stigmatize. So, my view is that it is perfectly appropriate to express the depth of one's emotions and the confidence and certainty one has in one's positions. But I don't think that it's desirable to be name-calling and stigmatizing people in a way that's not really respectful or civil. That's the best I guess I can answer to that. I think it depends. What one means by that depends a bit on the circumstances.
Okay. Am I passing down?
American universities host and train a lot of foreign students who go on to become elite leaders in their own countries, particularly places like China. And I worry that, Chinese undergrads and grad students come here kind of expecting the promise of free speech, and they don't really see it happening. Do you think we have an especially heavy burden to get it right, because we are a role model for other countries that don't have the same free speech protections? And what do we do about that?
Well, I think our responsibility to get it right is our responsibility to get it right, regardless of whether we had foreign students or not. But the point you make is an interesting one. When I teach courses in our law school, or when I give undergraduate courses, every week I have coffee with groups of 6 or 7 of the students. And during one of those sessions last spring, there were a group of LLM students, foreign students in the law school, who signed up together to have coffee with me. And it turned out that they were all from Asia. I don't know if they were all from China, but they're all from Asia. And one of the things they said was how disappointed they were in what they saw in the culture of universities in the United States with respect to the willingness to accept the principle of free speech. And I said to them, it's interesting, because if they'd been here 10 years earlier, they wouldn't have seen that. And this was a contemporary phenomenon, and it was one that that colleges and universities were wrestling with and trying to figure out how to cope with. And that my hope was that over time, they would figure out how to do this effectively and would ultimately come back to a position where if they came here 5, 10 years from now, they would admire the fact that our institutions got there. But the fact is, and this is in sympathy to these institutions, this hit us like a hurricane. And we hadn't been thinking about these issues because they weren't issues before. And suddenly they've sort of exploded on our campuses. And one of the things I think administrators and faculty members have tended to do is to react to the immediacy of the sense of their students who are in pain and who are distraught and want to address that issue in the immediate. And it's completely understandable, I think. And I think as the years are going by, increasingly institutions are able to take a step back and look at this a bit more calmly, and also to try to figure out ways to help those students that might not have existed as readily before in a whole variety of ways that enable them to deal better with what they're experiencing. And also, I think universities are coming to realize the downside of accommodating those students to censorship. And the other thing I think that's happening now, which I think is very comforting, and I'm not sure this is true, but I'm glad I have an opportunity now to throw it out there for you guys to think about, is I think we are now already past the high point of this moment, and that it's going away. And I say this, first of all, because I have noticed simply that the number of incidents nationally seems to have declined. And I have simply just noticed this myself casually, just in reading the newspapers and so on. But in Greg and John's book, they have statistics which they don't actually focus on, but which I noticed, which is that the number of incidents has gone down 20% from 2016 to 2017. And I think that's going to continue. And I think that's going to continue for a couple of reasons. I don't know these are right. These are just speculation. One of them is that I think that the students who've invited the speakers, who have generated these conflicts, have paid a huge price for doing so. Right? They have been anathematized, stigmatized, right, by their fellow students and beyond. And the next generation of students watching that says, do I really want to do this to myself? Right? And they're probably much more reluctant now to invite people who are going to create for them the backlash that their predecessors have experienced. Now, that's not necessarily a good thing, because that's sort of chilling free speech. But I think realistically, it's happening. And as a consequence, we're not going to see as many students inviting these provocateurs as they did in the past. That's number one. Number two is I think the provocateurs are tired of this. There's only so many times you can go to a campus and have a big deal made about you, and it gets boring. And my guess is people like Ann Coulter and Milo Yiannopoulos and so on are not as excited about doing this over and over and over again. And so they're probably not as interested in doing these things. And the third, and I hope the most positive and most important thing, is the point that I made in the talk, is that I hope students who are opposed to these speakers are coming to figure out that reacting in the way that their predecessors did is not a positive way to respond. That it may feel good in the moment, right? I'm being strong, I'm being tough, I'm shutting them down. But what they do come to realize is they're making these people more powerful. And whatever satisfaction they get from shutting them down, in the grand scheme of things, is outweighed by far by the harm they do by turning these people, by giving them megaphones, and by turning them into superstars. And I do think that students are beginning to understand that and figure it out. So my hope is that this is an issue that's going to become less prominent as we move forward. And that would be a great thing. I don't know that's going to happen, but that's my guess at the moment.
Okay, I'm going to give it to you, sir, and then over to you. Here, could you just pass this down?
Hi, thank you for the wonderful lecture. You've compressed an enormous amount of, for example, the kind of history of free speech and central ideas of free speech, which I teach over 10 weeks in a free speech class. And I just wanted to give you what I've found the most vexing arguments to respond to, channeling myself as an 18-year-old who's just arrived at the university and is passionately committed to social justice for especially the people who've been ignored, or apparently success stories, but are also not success stories. And you can picture yourself in the quadrangle of Silliman Hall or Silliman College at Yale, alongside of Nicholas Christakis, who's trying to get a Millian-style debate going, and the students are vacillating between tears and cursing him out and telling him to shut the fuck up. And that passion, I mean, which I've just gotten from some students, they argue that free speech is the roots of power, right? And the reason we defend it so much is because we're powerful in relationship to others who feel silenced or don't have the political and economic context to speak freely. So what do you say to and the whole history of free speech is, for them, not very interesting. And they want to kind of organize and do something. So what kind of advice or response do you give to that argument if it's addressed to you and you hear it?
So a couple of elements of that. One is that it's true that at any given time in society, those in positions of authority and power, right, are often in a position to dominate the free speech marketplace of ideas. They have more resources and more voice and so on. So is this a fair marketplace, right? And the answer is it's not. But if you gave those same people the power to decide whose ideas get to be expressed, it would be an even less fair marketplace. And that's part of the problem. So one difficulty that the students, I think, have to understand is if they could be the dictator and they could determine who can speak and who can't speak, then it's easy to see why they would want the dictator to have that power, right? But they are not the dictator. And if they decide to argue for that it's okay to censor speech you don't like, they will lose, they will not win. And therefore they're playing on a not level playing field, but it's a playing field they can still compete on, which is better than the alternative. The second point I make, which is kind of related to what you were saying, I think, is that one of the main arguments that students today make about free speech is, okay, even if I accept the free speech stuff, right, it shouldn't apply to hate speech. It shouldn't apply to speech that is racist and sexist and homophobic and so on. That's ugly, it's illegitimate, it's immoral. There's no reason why we should regard that as within the scope of what we regard as the freedom of speech. And there's a lot of power to that argument, in part because many Western democracies have taken that view. And in some sense, we are an outlier, both legally and in terms of the First Amendment and in terms of what our universities do who are not covered by the First Amendment, in saying that that kind of speech cannot be prohibited. Because if you look at other countries around the world in Western democracies, they have much greater restrictions on that. And again, the answer to that has to be not that I think personally hateful speech is attractive or desirable, but that I don't trust anyone else to have the power to decide what speech gets allowed and what doesn't get allowed. And people who wanted to suppress critics of World War I during the war would say, our sons, to some extent daughters, are out there risking their lives. In many instances already having given their lives. You're going to tell me that's for nothing? You're going to tell me that's pointless? You know how much pain that causes me? Right? You can't inflict that on me. Go to hell. Right? I mean, the problem is that lots of speech causes lots of pain to lots of people. Now, hate speech, as we define it, if we define it narrowly, is particularly that way because of our own history. But the fact is that if you understand part of the reason for wanting to suppress speech, in general, right? Think about pro-abortion speech, right? People who believe that abortion is the murder of unborn children, right? For them to hear that, I have no doubt, is unbelievably painful. What the fuck are you talking about? Don't you know what you're talking about? Genocide, right? So I think part of it is they have to put themselves on the heads of other people in that situation. Yeah.
Hi. So I think it was interesting what you were saying about, your prediction or your speculation that it will continue to go down, and you might be right, which just partly suggests that what a poor metric that is. But also, it raises the question, so what I see is that a lot of what's going on is a lot more, I don't know if latent is the right word, but in other words, you could have, there's still, even without a single person complaining, without a single disinvitation, there's still an enormous problem going on that's sort of lying beneath the surface about, what work gets done, what questions get asked, what don't get asked, what explanations get offered, what material is taught. So there's still this massive sort of behemoth of a problem, even without a single person complaining. And so I guess I just wonder sort of where that fits in.
No, I think that's a great question. I mean, wholly apart from the stopping speakers issues, there is the question, to use the cliche of political correctness. I don't teach things today that I used to teach, and I don't teach things today the same way I did in the past in some areas, because it will generate aggravation. I'm not so concerned about the fact that it will upset the students in and of themselves. That doesn't bother me. I'm a law professor. God damn it, they should learn to live with that, right? But who needs the aggravation, right? They're going to get angry at me, and I have to deal with that, right? Screw it, right? Now, I think I'm more resistant to that than many people are, but even I yield on that. And I don't think that's good. I think that's terrible, because these are things we should be talking about, right? So a good example, if you're a law professor teaching affirmative action, right? In the past, I would have had little qualm calling on a student Socratically and saying, okay, if you were making the argument that affirmative action is unconstitutional, right, what would you argue? And I would push the students to make the argument that affirmative action is not actually serving a positive purpose. It is actually harming its supposed beneficiary. That the consequence of affirmative action, in many instances, is taking students who would do better in life if they went to a lower ranked school and did well, than if you used them to increase the, quote, diversity of your higher ranked school, even though the actual quality of the educational experience they get is less beneficial to them, right? Now, today, putting a student in the position of making that argument is almost impossible. But it's a real issue, right? It's a real question. And yet you can't talk about it. So I'm saying you're right, that this is a problem.
Just go a little further. I mean, further, because you're sort of basing an argument saying that there's pent-up demand, so that as a faculty member, you're no longer bringing up information or sort of bringing up perspectives that you would have 10 or 15 years ago. But I would say that I would go even further and say that even in the absence of pent-up demand, there's still an issue. So, for instance, in sociology, there is, the way material is taught, the way textbooks are written, it's, everything is sort of socially, structurally determined, and that is how we view the world. And there is no, even without anyone complaining, without any faculty feeling like they can't say things that they want to say, there's still an issue in terms of the way material is presented. So I'll stop.
I'm gonna give one more question. I know we're about at time, and because I'm the one with the microphone, and this professor is right here, I'm gonna give you the last question.
I'll try to be really fast, but I think this is connected to what you were talking about. I was thinking about how I'm in the social sciences, and I think I'm in the category of, 17-1 in terms of political diversity in my field. And I think this is related to Geoffrey Miller's comments earlier too. I wonder how much of the wave of protests, new initiatives, I think of Brown's first safe space, how much of this is with faculty operating on the backside of things?
What do you mean by that? I don't-
Not student propelled, but faculty initiated. When I think about what I teach and concern about, I teach individual differences in IQ, I talk about sex differences, sexual strategies, all the things that the sociology textbooks ignore. When I think about the possibility of me losing my job, it's not from a student. It's from a fellow faculty member who causes an uprising against what I do and the data I present. And I wonder what's the faculty side of things?
Well, obviously, I would say, among other things, as a former dean and provost, faculty should not do that, right? Faculty should not do that. So the question is, and I have to say, at my institution, we have a pretty good culture on those in that regard. There are instances where I've seen over the years where that kind of thing has happened, but Chicago's pretty good about that. But, so what do you do about that? So part of it depends upon whether the faculty members or member who is creating the problem is somebody who's sane. Sometimes when I hear about these instances, the impression you get is that person's nuts. And that's an additional problem, right? If the person is sane, then the question is, what do the colleagues do about that, right? And I think colleagues should intervene in that situation and try to find a way to avoid conduct that interferes with the academic freedom of all of their colleagues, right? They should protect that and protect one another in that. If they don't do that, then either they're just not being very good academics, or they're taking a side, right? They think one of the two, assuming it's two people in particular, one of the two is the crazy one, right? And it may be you in their view, not the other person. I don't know anything about the details. But, you know, my view on this is that it is the responsibility of faculty members to protect academic freedom and to protect their colleagues' ability to write and think and teach what they want, as long as it meets the academic standards, right, of quality, not ideology, that the institution aspires to. And if another faculty member is behaving badly in that regard, then I also think that, again, in terms of at least issues of civility and mutual respect, it's appropriate for colleagues and chairs and deans to say, hey, this is not the kind of behavior that we aspire to. But a lot of this is in the eye of the beholder, right? The problems in these situations is it's often the case that each side thinks the other one's the crazy one, right? And mediating that can be complicated. But you know, my view would be this is what the faculty has to be responsible for, and they should take the initiative of trying to figure out how to solve this problem and to protect the academic freedom of the individual who's being attacked.